You people missed me, didn't you? I'll just tell you this. When your best friend becomes the Campese's delivery guy, you know you got to change your life. I've missed all you guys too. We've missed you. The committee's missed you. It's been so weird this last couple of years. When we went out to this studio and recorded the reviews this last couple of summers, and I would go out there to introduce, we would do more than one in a day. And I always had to remember to take different shirts. So it didn't look like I was just doing the same thing in the same clothes. So I'll try to remember that this summer and put on different clothes when we come back. Listen, we're as you can imagine, I'm unbelievably happy that we're back here, that you guys are here. I'm sure you've missed it too, and we've got really. I'll recognize the committee later on in the summer because they did a great job. We have a really heavy weight. We just thought we're coming back. Let's come back big. And so we've got a great thing to start off tonight. I was just remembering that we had Dave a long time ago. In fact, it was so long ago that he didn't have gray hair, and he worked for the Star-Telegram in Fort Worth. So things have changed quite a bit since then. In any event, I'm just going to get out of here real quick. I'm just going to say once again, we're glad you're here. I'm going to turn this over to Richard, who will welcome you and introduce the person that will introduce Dave Lieber. So again, thanks for coming.
And I'm here to sort of do an administrative introduction to the series because there's several things that have come up you probably need to know about. If you're not already on the list getting emails, there are cards in our little hub area that you can fill out. They say Authors Live. Fill them out and we'll put you on the list so you get any emails from us. Now, people have asked, were we going to stream this? No. We're recording it. And each of the presenters, we're asking them, can we put it up in August and let people know so anything they miss, they can watch in August online. That's the way we're going to handle that. We've also had some confusion about whether or not people have to sign up to come to this. They do not. We're just taking reservations for dinner. The online reservations, you have to pay when you make them. The phone reservations, we put you on a list and we collect cash or check night of. So that's those. Also, we didn't tell you this, but there's a new parking garage on Hillcrest. It's SMU's parking garage. It's right behind our parking lot. We will have the gates open on that. You will have to park on the bottom floor, which is dedicated to our folks. Other than that, you will always have the parking under the Meadows. Just make sure to park. The sign says park on the left. You go into the Meadows Museum bottom, park on the church side. You can park there. So there's plenty of parking between Meadows, the new Hillcrest garage SMU has. You can park on Abbott and walk in, or you've got our parking lot. So that should be sufficient for us, I think. There's book sales for 3 of these afterwards. Tonight, Dave Lieber's book, Searching for Perot. And then on the 15th, David McCloskey is here with Damascus Station. And then on the 6th, Kathleen Kent is here with The Heretic's Daughter. And there will be book sales after each one of those. They will be slightly different depending on who's selling. These are not being sold by a bookseller. We're doing that individually ourselves. So we'll let you know what that is each time. But David Lieber will be up under the vine on that floor with Searching for Perot and at the signing table where you can buy a book, and also he can personalize it and all that. Other than that, I think I've told you everything you need to know. So let's pray. Father, it's such a joy to be together again, to learn and to have fun, and just to be together again. Thank you for this series. Thank you for the joy of community. In the midst of that, we remember that there are those who do suffer, and the parents in Uvalde, the Ukrainians under constant attack. So we know it's a privilege to have the joy we have, but we remember those who are under such stress. But we always know that you're with us. We are not alone, and that is the joy of your creation. And we thank you for all of that in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen. Now I want to introduce Susan Wilson of the Rejebian Committee, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Richard. Good evening. You may be familiar with our speaker. For the past 9 years, he's been the Watchdog investigative columnist exposing wrongdoing twice a week in the Dallas Morning News. Previously, he did that job for 20 years at the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. In his rare spare time, he writes books, 9 so far, and now 2 plays. The first play is about Amon Carter, Mr. Fort Worth. It was a big hit. 36 shows in 6 Texas cities, named Best New Play by a local playwright. His newest play and companion book is about Ross Perot Sr. His play, Perot, American Patriot, opened February 11th at the new Capel Arts Center for 9 sellout shows. Exciting times for Dave Lieber. His Perot project is attracting attention. It's a tribute for all Perot and his family have done for Dallas, Texas, the United States, and abroad. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dave Lieber.
Well, first off, I want to say thank you because I've never been called a heavyweight before, so that's kind of cool. And I also want to say hello to the people in the balcony because I've been speaking for a long time. I started when I was 21 years old, and I've never had a balcony audience before. This is big time here, you know? So every time I go to a Rejebian book review club, I always talk about Ermance Rejebian because I think she was really cool that she came up with this whole concept and pushed it and kept it going all these decades later. And what an honor today to meet Jane, her daughter-in-law, and David, her grandson. Because I am serious about honoring Mrs. Rejebian, and I think I can prove it because I brought her with me today, okay? I'll just have her sit over here and watch. Her papers are at SMU, you know, and I was going through the research now and trying to find water bottles they're not flat anymore. So, and I studied her life, and I've really been impressed. And one of the things I learned that I didn't know was, and you might know this, although you look kind of young to remember, but in the 40s and 50s, she had a weekly broadcast on WFAA radio which she would talk about the news of the week and everything like that. And so all of her papers and all of her speeches and all of her audios are all at SMU Library and neatly cataloged, and it's just really cool. So, Ermance, I hope you enjoy this, okay? So, our story here begins in 1957, which is 1 or 2 years later than when this Rejebian club formed here. I think it formed here in 56. And there's a newlywed couple. They've been married for a year, and they're driving from Texarkana to Dallas so that Mr. Ross Perot and his wife, Margot, can set up their new life in Dallas. And Ross is going there to be an IBM salesman. And he's driving across the state in a Plymouth. And everything they own in that car is in the back seat or the trunk, because the Perots, they have nothing at this point. They're just starting from scratch. And when Ross gets to the apartment complex in Dallas where he's going to move with wife, he remembers what his father taught him, an East Texas cotton trader: negotiate, negotiate, negotiate. And so he starts talking to the landlord, and the rent is like $115, and he says, "What do I got to do to lower it?" And the landlord says, "Well, I need a property manager, a landscaper, and a handyman. If you take on those jobs here in this apartment complex, I'll lower your rent $20, I'll make it $95. Perot said, "Deal." Now, I always think about that. If you lived in this apartment complex in 1957, 1958, and your toilet broke, Ross Perot was going to show up and fix it, you know? He didn't know what he wanted to be when he grew up because he had not invented it yet. But as he lived in that apartment, you know, they only had one car, and Margot had to keep it. She'd drop him off at work, and then she'd keep the car the rest of the day, and then she'd pick him up because they couldn't afford two cars. But he was a happy man starting that job at IBM. He'd come home every night he could at 6:30 p.m., whistling in the front door, happy to be with his family, kiss his wife hello, hug his kids, tell him he loved him, and give him the slogan, which was the Perot family slogan, which was buddies to the end. Now, my experience with them was covering Perot Jr. as he built Alliance for the Star-Telegram and watching that whole thing grow in an unbelievable way. And I remember one time in the Star-Telegram, I wrote this comment. I said, I would like to ride in Ross Perot Jr.'s helicopter. Just a kind of a throwaway line. But I really did, because he used to fly CEOs over the land to show them where they could move their companies, and 550 have since then. And he also he was a world record holder in a helicopter. Do you remember this? When he was 23 years old, Ross Perot Jr. decided he wanted to break the world's record for flying a helicopter around the world, and he did in 29 days. So he was a record holder, and here I am waiting at the helipad for him to drop out of the sky, and he's going to take me on a ride. And I remember three things from that ride. The first thing I remember is that we were both wearing headsets, and we were talking through the headsets, and I made a lot of jokes. He didn't laugh at a single one of them. I just got more laughter from all of you right here than I got from Ross Jr. in that whole 2-hour ride. Second thing I remember is I had moved into his first master plan community. It was called Parkland. He's built over 70 since then, but this was the first. And I moved in because I thought if I did, I could get funny stories for the newspaper, you know, about what it would be like to live in Perotville. And I did. I wrote a lot of stories about living in Perotville. And I said, hey, Mr. Perot, let's go over, I'll show you where I live in Perotville. And he didn't like that. He said, it's not Perotville, it's Parkland. He says, my name is not part of it. Okay, so I got chewed out. I still kept calling it Perotville, though, later. And the other thing I remember is a quote that he said to me, which I'll never forget, which was, I saw the American dream unfold in my living room. Because I had asked him, what's it like to be the son of a presidential candidate? I saw the American dream unfold in my living room. I voted for him in '92, and moving into Perotville was my way to pay tribute to his energy and his excitement, because I knew that the community would reflect that, and it did. But it was only when I began to put the pieces together for a play and for a book about him that I discovered something really amazing. He took $1,000, which is what his wife Margot had invested in EDS, which we'll get to, and he turned that with his family into a fortune that Forbes today says is worth $7.4 billion. And if he were here right now, he would shut me up. He would say, do not talk about money. He'd say, that's the least important part of this story. And I would say, Mr. Perot, I really have to talk about the money, because, you know, I'd say billionaires, they make their money one or two ways, but you made your money 5 different ways. And they were all really interesting. And he'd say, well, what do you mean? And I'd say, well, let's look at it. You know, first thing you did was you created EDS, Electronic Data Systems, the first computer services company in the world. And you eventually put it on the stock market, and overnight, pretty much, you made $230 million. And so you became what Forbes called the fastest, richest Texan ever. That's pretty impressive. $230 million, you're a millionaire. But then you sold it to General Motors for $2.5 billion, and you became a billionaire. And then you were such a pain in the you-know-what at GM in a good way that they got you in a buyout. They gave you $750 million just to go away. That's pretty cool. And then you started with your son, Perot Systems, and eventually you sold that to Dell for almost $4 billion. And he'd say, well, what's the 5th way that I made money? And I'd say, Alliance, Texas, you know, and he'd go, that's my son. I go, but yeah, but you helped kick it off. And so, you know, he'd say, all right, now button it up, no more talk about money. And I would agree. Because here's what I learned. This story about this man is not about money. It's about family, it's about values, passing values down to generations. But really what it's about, much to my surprise, it turned out to be a story about love. Totally about love. When I research an individual for my journalism, I like to learn about their parents, because when you find out about someone's parents, you find out a lot about them. Like, for example, this gentleman here, Eamon Carter, Mr. Fort Worth, he owned Channel 5. He started WBAP Radio, and he owned the Star Telegram for 50 years. He had a terrible upbringing. His father married the wicked stepmother, and she threw him out of the house. He was 13 years old, and he had to go to work as an adult in Decatur and Wise County and Bowie as a teen. Well, Ross didn't have that problem. Ross had two of the most loving parents, and even they brought him up during the Great Depression, and he didn't feel poor because there was so much love. But his father and his mother taught him two different things, two sides of a coin. His father taught him about business, and his mother taught him about loving people. The way that worked out was his father would pick him up after school and take him horseback riding every day he could. And just that fact alone, I'm so jealous, because I didn't have that kind of relationship with my dad. Ross's dad, Gabriel, he would teach him about the history of Texas. He would tell him what happened at work that day. And he would just go over, all these things that a father should be telling his son, the stuff that my father never bothered to tell me. I had to figure it out for myself. But, the cool thing about his father was Ross started working when he was 6 years old, going door to door, selling seeds and magazines, and he had a paper route and all that. But the thing that his father really did with him that was important was he took him to the auction barns, and he taught him how to buy and trade and sell. And Ross's father's family motto wasn't buddies to the end. It was, sell it, you can't eat it. And what that meant was, if you're going to buy something in the morning and you have to take it home at night, we're going to have to feed it, and we don't want to feed it. So he started off with bridles. He'd buy one in the morning, he'd sell it in the afternoon. Then he went to saddles. He'd buy one in the morning, he'd sell it in the afternoon. Then he went to ponies. He'd bought them and sell them in the afternoon. And Ross was learning about business. He said, I got my PhD from my father. Now, Mom was the softie. She was the lover of people. She was a philanthropist. Philanthropy doesn't mean giving away all your money. Philanthropy in Greek means loving people. And Mrs. Perot, they called him Perot back then in East Texas. Mrs. Perot, Lou LeMay, who I understand there's a garden out there for her, she said, I want to help the guys who get off the train here, the hobos who jump off the train in Texarkana, and I want to help them. They're having a hard life. So whenever anyone would knock on the door at their house, no matter how dirty or scary this man looked, she'd let this tramp in and set him down at the dinner table and feed him dinner. And one day, one of these tramps said, ma'am, do you know why we come to your house? And she said, no, I don't. He said, well, let me go show you. Come on, let's go. And they went out to the curb, and there on the curb was this scratched out X. And the man said, ma'am, when we see an X, we know that when we knock on the door, the woman of the house will open it and she will feed us. So the man left, and young Ross says to his mother, Mama, do you want me to wash that mark off the curb? And she says, no, son, leave it there. These are good people. They're just like us, but they're down in their luck, and we should help them. Backing that up, every day when he went to elementary school, I found that he would say the following prayer. Help a man who is down today. Give him a lift in his sorrow. Life has a very strange way. No one knows what will happen tomorrow. Now, if you go over to the Plano campus of the North Texas Food Bank, and it's called the Perot campus, in front of the front door is a sculpture of an X, a silver-colored X, which is in honor of Mrs. Perot and what she did setting all that up. And I always love that's it's been 80 years, and we're still talking about that X. He didn't really show great promise as a young, real small child. I mean, he had the door-to-door deliveries and the routes and all that, making money. But he didn't really have, like the respect of the teachers in school. His teachers would come up to him and they'd annoy him and they'd say, Ross, why aren't you smart like your sister Betty? And he didn't know what to say to that. But for the first time in his life, he proved himself when, how many people in here are Eagle Scouts or parents of Eagle Scouts? Congratulations. He got his Eagle Scout badge in about a year's time, which you just don't do, but he was so determined that he did it in a year's time. And that was the first time that I could find that he really showed his mettle. Well, he goes off to Texarkana Junior College when he graduates high school, and he studies pre-law. And there must be something special about this little 5'6" man with the East Texas twang and the ears, big ears, because he's elected student body president. Very impressive. And what does he do? Well, he starts monitoring the board of trustees, and he sets up an intramural sports program for all the students. But he also tells the board of trustees that they're making a big mistake. He said, you're going to expand your campus on the other side, right here on the other side of this building. But he said, you shouldn't do that. You should go to the other side of town and buy this big plot of land, because then you can, expand for the next century. And they took his advice, and they did. They went to the other side of town, which I love the fact, because the commercial real estate broker who was handling that deal, he was like, you're listening to a 19-year-old tell you where to move? And they said, yeah, and it worked out. But he didn't want to be in college. The weird thing was he wanted to be in the Navy. And that's really weird because he'd never seen a ship in his life. He'd never flown on an airplane. He's never even seen the ocean. But there was this really cool guy in Texarkana who walked around in his naval uniform, and Ross said, I want to be like him. And so every year he'd apply to the Naval Academy. And then finally, Governor Papio Daniel appoints him, and he gets on his first plane ride and he flies to Annapolis. And guess what? He does really well there. He's no longer Perot, he's now Ross Perot. And he's elected class president. Not only class president, but class president of the class of 1953 for life, a job he held until his passing. He was so well respected that when Dwight Eisenhower and Mamie, 4 years before they went to the White House, came to Annapolis for a tour, they picked Ross to give him the tour. They also put him on the Code of Conduct Committee. They said, you're going to be chairman of the Code of Conduct Committee, and we want you to write a code of conduct for the Navy. And he said, okay, I'll be. And he sat down with the committee, and they started working on this code. But then something happened. An admiral's son misbehaved somehow, broke a rule, but they didn't punish him. They swept it under the rug. And Ross said, I can't be a part of this. He said, I'm quitting as president of my class, and I'm quitting the Code of Conduct Committee. And the head of the Naval Academy called him in and said, Ross, I want to compliment you. You're doing exactly what we've taught you to do. So I want you to come back and be president and be chairman of the committee, because we're going to take care of that boy. And there we are. He wrote the Code of Conduct with others, and it's been in effect for all these decades since. Very impressive. But, he wasn't a big fan of the Navy. He paid his dues, he did his job, but he wanted to get out early. He called the Navy a godless organization. He was such a straight arrow that when the men would pull into a port and go off and do what Navy men in the 50s, he would stay on the ship. And one of my favorite quotes from him is this. He said, I do not enjoy the prospect of continuing to stand on the quarterdeck as officer of the deck in foreign ports, being subjected to drunken tales of moral emptiness, passing out penicillin pills, and seeing promiscuity on the part of married men. I constantly hear the Lord's name taken in vain at all levels. Before he gets out of the Navy, though, there's a visitor on his ship. And the visitor is watching Perot run the ship. He's up there in the captain's room. He's steering. He's pushing buttons and levers. He's doing it all. And the guy says, who is that? And they go, oh, that's Ross Perot. He's going to leave the Navy in a couple of weeks. They go, okay. The man walks up to Ross, and he says, young man, I've been watching you. I'd like to know, would you like an interview with my company, IBM? And Ross says, Mister, I'm 26 years old, and I have worked since I was 6, and you are the first person who has ever offered me a job. I always had to look for work. You bet I would like to have an interview with your company, and I don't even know what you do. And the man said, you don't know what IBM does? And he said, well, I know you make typewriters. No, Ross, I'm interested in you because the captain tells me that you have a lot of knowledge about the gunfire control computers, and we are in the computer business. So that's how we go back to where we started this story. In 1957, Margot and Ross are driving to Dallas to start his new job at IBM. And he turned out to be probably the greatest salesman in the history of the company. He would sell these big computers that were this big, they cost $1 million, and he said selling them to companies was like selling umbrellas in a rainstorm because everybody had to have one, but they didn't know really how to work it. And one of the reasons he was so successful was because he was focused. He didn't hang out with the other salesmen. He didn't go to the coffee pot in the morning and stand around with them gossiping over coffee. He didn't meet them for the 3-martini lunch, and he didn't meet them at night for happy hour. He'd come home at 6:30 for dinner, whistling, hugging his wife, hugging his kids, and reminding everyone of the family slogan, buddies to the end. He was making more money at IBM than his bosses were. And they didn't like that. So they changed the salary structure because he made his quota by January 15th of the year. He had nothing left to do. The way he protested is adorable. He would show up to work with a towel and a bathing suit and go, well, I don't have anything to do today, so I guess I'll go swimming. I love that. So he was trying to figure out a way that he could stay at the company because he figured if he knew it was a great company. But he had 2 ideas that he thought could keep him involved. And he went to the head of IBM and he told them his 2 ideas. They were brilliant. The first one was, he said, look, we're not using computers from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. Why don't we lease out the computers to companies that can't afford it, but we can let them use it in the middle of the night? And they said, no, we don't want to do that. We want to sell computers. Okay. He said, well, then why don't we create software? Because we're in the hardware business, but when we sell these computers to people, they don't know how to run them. But if we make software for their industry, then they will be able to use them to their full capacity. And they said no. So he knew right then he had no future at IBM, but he wasn't sure what he wanted to do. So one day in 1961, in December, he's sitting in his barber shop, which is still there, Preston Forest Barbers. Anybody here get their haircut there? Yeah. And when a man has a haircut like that, he's getting one pretty much every 10 days, right? And so he's sitting there waiting to get his cut, and he's reading this issue of Reader's Digest, December of 1961. eBay is a wonderful thing. You can get the old copies of old magazines. And he's reading this story about Henry David Thoreau of Walden Pond, and he sees this quote. The quote is, "The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation." And he reads it again, "The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation." And he says, that could be me. I could be that mass of men leading. He says, I got to do something. But he doesn't know what to do. He's sitting in church a few weeks later, and he's inspired. The music is the singing, the choir, and he pulls out the pledge card in the pew in front of him, and he writes down on the pledge card the name of his company, Electronic Data Systems, EDS. And that's how one of the greatest companies in the history of tech was formed. He goes home to Margot and he says, would you invest $1,000 to get me started? And she had earned this money as a teacher at the Green Hill School, and that's it. They're off to the races. The problem is he's trying to sell this company and no one understands what it does because there wasn't any other companies like it. Remember what I said? He didn't know what he wanted to be when he grew up because he hadn't invented it yet. Well, now he hasn't invented it. He's struggling for several months to find somebody to hire him. And then finally he gets this great company that we all support, Frito-Lay. And once he gets Frito-Lay, he's off to the races now. He says, I billed Frito-Lay $5,128 a month for the data processing. And I used odd numbers like 5128 in those days to make it look like I knew exactly what I was doing. Like I had figured everything down to the last penny. And he said, I tell my clients, you have to pay in advance. And when they asked why, he said, it's customary in the computer services industry. He admits the business is so new that there's no customs. I'm just making it up as I go along. So he gets lucky. In the mid-'60s, Congress passes these laws, which I think you're too young to appreciate. They were called Medicare and Medicaid. And they give this power to disseminate this through the states, and the states cannot do it because they don't have any computer experience. They don't know what they're doing. So he starts going after these contracts, and he gets a bunch of them. Mort Meyerson, before he became a symphony center, he was president of EDS, and he said the following. He said, Ross is a Boy Scout who knows how to street fight. You know, he created this entire computer services industry from scratch, but yet in his whole life of 89 years, Ross Perot never once owned a computer. He had a typewriter, a Remington Rand that he bought secondhand in the Navy, and on Sunday nights he'd sit at the dining room table and he'd type out his schedule, but that was it. He did rescue Steve Jobs when Steve Jobs, this is a forgotten piece of tech history, when Steve Jobs was fired from Apple the first time, he started a company called Next, and Ross sat on the board and became a 16% investor, and Steve Jobs says if it wasn't for Ross, I might not have had an iPhone, an iPad, and an iWatch, and everything else, you know. So he's getting these contracts all over the country, and now he's making some serious money. His second campus, you might remember it was on the 7100 block of Forest Lane. It was this big white building that's still there. I think it's unoccupied, and it's supposedly nuclear bomb-proof. The walls were so thick and everything. And he built this on the land that used to be something called the Rolling Hills Country Club. Some of you might remember that. And they had an 18-hole golf course there, and he decided to keep most of the country club intact. He kept 9 holes, and he hired a golf course manager. He kept the pool, he kept the tennis court, the picnic area, the clubhouse, fishing pond, jogging trails, softball fields, playground. You know, just like what Google and LinkedIn and Twitter, they all do today. They all have their campuses are for people to stay and work. But this was in the mid-'60s. No one did this. No one did this. He also had this cafeteria, which was a very important part of his life because he would meet you in the cafeteria. He'd say, "Hi, I'm Ross Perot. What's your name? I don't think we've met. Where are you from?" And so this was like revolutionary. Now, it was forward-looking. He was 30, 40, 50 years ahead of his time to feed and entertain his workers on the campus. The way he was behind, though, was with his dress code. And you know what it is, right? That short haircut, no facial hair, no beard, mustache. Shirts had to be white. I wore a white shirt in honor of him, but I don't think he would have permitted it. You had to have a tie it did not attract attention. If your tie got complimented, you were supposed to take it off. Your shoes were spit polished clean, you know, and of course, it was even worse for the women. The women were not allowed to wear pantsuits. They had to wear dresses. Now, I have to ask, are there any women here tonight that are in pantsuits? Please raise your hand. I'm afraid you're going to have to go home and change, okay? So he's doing really well with EDS, and he's making a lot of money, and he's bringing the great quality of life to all his employees. They're making money through stock options, and they're doing really well. And what happens next is really my favorite Ross Perot story, one that I didn't know at the time. I didn't follow it, but in the mid-'80s, Roger Smith, the CEO of General Motors, which was the #1 company in the world, decides he wants to computerize the entire car industry from design all the way to sales and repairs. And he says there's only one man who can do that, and that's Ross Perot. And he and Perot negotiated. It takes a while, but eventually Perot agrees to sell General Motors, EDS to General Motors. He's put on the board of GM, and he's the largest stockholder. And he says, my purpose is to revolutionize the car industry. He says, I'm going to make it so that when I'm done here, the Japanese are going to be buying American cars. We won't be buying their cars. So some things happened that upset him right off the bat. Roger Smith lays off 30,000 U.S. workers and 11 factories and moves all the jobs to Mexico. And I think that frustrated Perot so much, maybe that's where he came up with that idea of the giant sucking sound of jobs, you know, leaving the country. there was a culture clash between the EDS boys, their clean-cut, no mustache beard coming up to Detroit, and the hippies that ran the IT department at GM. Nobody bothered to tell these guys that these Texans were coming up to take over. And so they show up, and they're immediately hated. The EDS boys get their car tires slashed in the parking lot. They send Morton Meyerson, the president of EDS, to Detroit to fix it, and he lands at Detroit Airport, and he says, I'm here, can you guys send a car to pick me up? And General Motors says, I'm sorry, we don't have any cars available. He can't stand the fact that that the General Motors executives are eating all their meals in the 14th floor executive dining room. He says, you don't have executive dining rooms. He said, you eat in the cafeteria with your employees, and that's how you learn who they are and what matters. And they said, no, we don't want to do that because we don't want to hang out with the United Auto Workers downstairs. And Perot said, well, that's not how we do it in Texas. He also hated the fact that as a board member, every 3 months they would drop a new car off at his house. It was like all jacked up and tweaked perfectly, so it was like the best car ever. And he says, I don't want your car every 3 months. I want to see what it's like myself. I want a mystery shop. So every weekend that he could, he'd put on sunglasses and a baseball cap, and he'd go out to a GM dealership, and he'd talk to the sales manager, and he'd talk to the salesman and the repair people, and he'd buy a car. He'd learn what it was like. And the GM people couldn't believe it. They said, that's not what you're supposed to do as the biggest stockholder on the board. He's getting more and more frustrated. He says, I don't understand why it takes y'all 5 years to design a car when it only took us 4 years to win World War II. He said, it's not a moonshot. Forbes said, this is Ross Perot's crusade. And all of you know in corporate America, you're not allowed to run one-man, one-woman crusades. They take you out. And they decided that they needed to get rid of him. So Tom Luce, his lawyer, and they start negotiating, and they name this impossibly high figure. In 1986 dollars, $750 million if you'll go away. And Tom says, sold. Ross can't believe that they're paying him what would probably be $1.5 billion or $2 billion just to go away. And he gives them 3 weeks to change their mind, but they don't. And he keeps the money. I love that story because back in the 60s and 70s when all this happened, we didn't talk about CEO pay. You know, Ross didn't think that Roger Smith was worth all the money he was being paid. You know, now CEO to ratio pay is a big topic, and it hit home with me when I was invited to, the only CEO's office I've ever been invited to is a fellow named Randall Stevenson at AT&T. He wanted to criticize my stories in the paper about their customer service. Well, good luck with that. But in his final year, he made $28 million a year, and last year as a consultant, he made 18. And I just don't think that's right. If you've ever called customer service at AT&T, you know the man's not worth that kind of money. Somebody here works at AT&T, and they're very upset at me right now. Now, the other story that people remember the most, and I'm sure you remember it, was what happened in Iran. I mean, what kind of CEO creates a corporate commando squad to extract his 2 employees from Iran who are held hostage in a prison? You know, EDS had the contract to put social security numbers on every Iranian. And when the revolution happened with the Shah and the Ayatollah, all the EDS employees left except for the 2 top guys, Paul Ciparoni and Bill Gaylord. They were tossed into prison. And Ross got the phone call in Colorado where he was on a ski vacation. And he said it was the worst phone call he ever got in his life. And he flew back to Dallas and he called in 10 of his top guys from EDS who were ex-military. They were married in their 40s with kids. And he says, I want you guys to consider going on a secret mission. Will you guys do this? And they said, to a man, they said, yes, sir, we will. And Ross hires a legendary Special Forces retired colonel named Bull Simons. And the 11 of these people, they go out to this cottage that the Perots owned on Lake Grapevine, and they practice extracting these 2 guys from prison. Well, Perot gets really impatient, and he does something which is, like, in retrospect, insane. He decides that he wants to go to Iran to try and fix this. the State Department here and the president, the White House, none of them wanted to get involved because there was a revolution going on. But he goes to the airport with his passport. Ross Perot, they hadn't recognized him yet because he hadn't run for president. And he goes to visit the military and ask them for help in Tehran. And then he goes and he talks to the state people, the State Department people, and they won't help him. So he does like the craziest thing I think he probably ever did in his whole life. They're out in the streets yelling, "Death to America, death to capitalism." And he goes to the prison. He just walks right in. And when Bill and Paul see him coming down the hall, one of them says, "Oh my God, it's Perot. I didn't know he was coming. I would have shaved." And Ross says, "That's okay. That's okay." They said, "What are you doing here, sir? You're risking your life." He said, "Listen, guys, I just want to tell you that we're going to get you out. We got 11 guys out there, all ex-military, your buddies, and we're going to do it. I don't know if it's going to be tomorrow, the next day, the day after, next month, or soon, but just sit tight because it's going to happen." And sure enough, the revolution has its peak. The Shah flies to America where he has cancer treatment, and the Ayatollah flies in from Paris and takes over. And they open up the prison gates because that's what revolutionaries do. And 2,000 inmates go running out into the street. And so Bill and Paul catch up with their team, and they drive up to Istanbul. They even have a Iranian intern with them who spoke Farsi, who was their go-between to get him out. His name was Reza, and I actually met him at a party Saturday night. And I went up to him, and they told me who he was. It was Reza, and I walked to him, and I said, "Rashid." His face turned white, because that was his secret code name. So that was kind of a thrill for me to get to meet him. So, they fly to DFW from Istanbul, and there's a big banner at the airport that says, "Welcome home, Bill and Paul." And then the next day, they have a press conference at DFW Airport. No, not at DFW Airport, at EDS, I think. And this is the biggest story in the country. This corporate commando, this weird Texas guy sent his, if that had failed, they all could have been killed, and the wives would have sued, and there would have never been an EDS. But he put it all on the line. He really had to. His mother told him, she said, "Ross, you put these guys there. You got to get them out." And a few months later, you remember 52 American hostages were taken in the embassy? Well, here we are. 444 days Americans were held hostage. They sent helicopters out to rescue them. They all crashed in the desert. The American government couldn't get these guys out, but this man did in just a few weeks. And that was it was a miracle. And so Ken Follett wrote this great book, you might have read it, called Wings of Eagles. And NBC turned it into a 2-part miniseries where Burt Lancaster played Colonel Simons, and Richard Crenna, tall, handsome, dark Richard Crenna, played Ross Perot. I don't think he minded that a bit, So with all these things he's doing, his profile is growing. And so state government decides to take advantage of it. And the governor of Texas says, "Ross, will you please run the war on drugs in Texas? Your job is to eliminate drug using and drug selling and drug smuggling." And he takes it on, but he fails. But who can blame him? Because who could ever win the war on drugs in America? Nobody, right? But, he learns how the legislature works. And this is really important because a few years later, the next governor, Mark White, a Democrat, appoints Ross to revamp the Texas public education system through a new law in Austin. Are there any teachers here from the 1980s? Yeah. Well, I know what you're thinking right now. He made us take that test. That was a terrible thing he did. He went out and he just blasted teachers. He said a quote that I'll never forget, which I don't agree with. He said, "Teachers are the dumbest ones in college. They're the ones that go into schools." I don't agree, because I think everything I am today I owe to my teachers. But he goes into Austin, and he works really hard to get this bill passed. And he travels the state. But he doesn't ask questions. He tells people. He orders people. He says, "This is the way it's going to be." And he's very controversial. He says to the parents at meetings like this, he says, "Texas has a first-rate education on the drill team, the band, and the football team." He said, football coaches should not be making more money than school superintendents. He says football is way too emphasized. He says if a football coach has a losing season, they either fire him or they make him a principal. I see the teachers shaking their heads. He said to the parents, do you want adult entertainment or do you want your kids to learn? He says our children are going to grow up in a world and they don't know anything. They may have a heck of a time on Friday nights in high school, but for the rest of their lives, they're derelicts. I don't know. I don't call people derelicts. I just don't think I could get away with it. But he did. He said smartly, he said, we look smart because God put so much wealth under the ground, but our children are going to grow up in a world of rapid change. And the average person will change careers 5 times. And for that, he or she needs a fully developed intellect. There were some really good things in this 2,000-page bill. And there are no 2,000-page bills in Austin, but this was the mother of all bills. I mean, they had the teacher test, and they also had the high school senior graduation test. They put pre-K in there, which we didn't have at that time. And they limited class sizes in elementary school, which is a great thing. But they also did something that hurt a lot of families, hurt a lot of kids, and something called no pass, no play. You heard of that, right? If your kid missed one passing class, if your kid got a 69 instead of a 70 in math, he or she had to sit out a band, drill team, football, whatever. That wasn't very popular, but I liked it because it brought a semblance of balance back to the school system. They've cut that no pass, no play down to 3 weeks now, by the way. So he's got his hand in so many things. Iran, GM. What about the military? Any military folks here? Spouses, daughters, mothers, fathers? You know, he was obsessed with POWs and MIAs. He figured they were still locked away, and he wanted to rescue them because he said the government's not doing what it's supposed to do. We're not protecting these guys. So he did something really bizarre. He rented a jet from Brannock, and he filled it with the spouses of the POWs and with medical supplies and clothing and the children of POWs and reporters like me. And he said, we're going to go land in Hanoi, the enemy, and we're going to give these supplies to our POWs and make sure they get treated better. Well, the Hanoi said, you're not landing this plane here. And so he's flying around the world trying to figure out where to go. And they called it a PR disaster, but it wasn't a PR disaster. It was great because people were now talking about the POWs. And when the POWs got released in 1973, he threw a banquet for them in San Francisco, and he made sure that John Wayne was in the ticker tape parade that he threw for these POWs. And he spent the rest of his life supporting medical research for veterans. Gulf War syndrome, PTSD, it was his cause. And I could spend a whole hour talking about what he did for veterans, but he was called the godfather of the Vietnam veteran. But the subject of Vietnam, it depresses me. It does. I don't like to think about it, so I'm going to shift gears now and tell you that, his favorite expression in life, I think, was world class. Everything had to be world class. Well, turns out he was a world-class practical joker. Really good. I mean, the best maybe that ever lived. One time he was in a landscaping store and he saw a topiary that was carved to look like a naked woman, 12 feet tall. He said, I'll take 6 of those, please. And in the middle of the night, he and a buddy drove to 6 of the most highfalutin, high society Dallas socialites. These women are so important, they have their names on bridges. And they dumped these naked bushes on their lawns. The next morning, 3 women wake up and they're horrified and say, get that junk out of here. But the other 3 are like thrilled. And in my book, I have Linda Custard, with her picture with her and the naked bush. And she's put floodlights under it. He found out that his daughter, Suzanne, and his son-in-law, Patrick, were coming back to Dallas and needed a place to stay. So he said, let me find you a place. And they said, okay, Dad. So they drive up to the address, and there is a dilapidated deer lease trailer with the windows broken and the door busted. And next to it is an outhouse. Welcome home, Patrick and Suzanne, the sign says. And Patrick, I got to give the man courage because he did something you shouldn't do. He decided to get back at his father-in-law. He did. He saw an ad in the Dallas Morning News 3 days before Christmas, and he went, and the ad was for a camel, and he went and bought the camel. And he said, deliver the camel to the Perot house on Christmas morning. And they did. The trailer pulls up. The family sees the camel. They look at it. They go, wow, somebody bought us a stuffed camel. But then the camel did this. And Perot was so excited. He said, can I keep him? I want to show my friends, for the next few days. And Patrick said, yeah, you can keep him because I bought him. He's yours. He said, Dad, every wise man needs a camel. Teddy lived on their property for a couple of years, and then he moved up to where I live, near the Circle T Ranch up there in northeast Tarrant County. And I'd see Teddy the camel all the time driving down the street, and I'd see him with the cattle out there. And when Teddy died, I think he was the only camel that got his obituary printed in the newspaper. So when the New York guys, and I think he liked to poke New York people. I'm from New York. I think he probably would have liked to have jazzed me a little. When the New York guys were coming down from there to Dallas to help him set up EDS Going Public, he says to them at lunchtime, hey guys, you've been working really hard. I got a surprise for you. How would you like to be my guest at a billionaire's private club for lunch? And they're all excited, these New York guys. They figure they're going to meet like J.R. Ewing or something. And so he takes them across the street to a Dickies. And the owner of Dickies is totally involved with the joke. He's in on it. He's got the greasiest, smelliest, dirtiest apron that you could ever imagine. And he's standing there cutting at the counter. And he goes, are you the New York boys? I've been expecting you. I made something special for you tonight. Tonight's special for you boys is barbecued armadillo. And the New York guys are like freaking out because they don't want to be impolite, but they don't want to eat armadillo. So Ross is watching them pick at their food, and then he does that laugh. I can't really do it. He goes, huh? Because that's pork. Go ahead and eat it, guys. It's okay. They go, okay, fine. So, well, they get him back. He flies up to New York, I think it was to ring the bell at the stock exchange. And when he's in their office at lunch, they say, we're going to take you to an exclusive New York restaurant. So exclusive, it's not even listed anywhere, but it's called the Umbrella Club. And they take him downstairs in the parking garage where they've hired a New York hot dog stand and a picnic table, and Ross has a good laugh. And his son, Ross Jr., said, if my dad plays a practical joke on you, you should be honored. That means he loves you. But don't think for a minute that you can get him back, because he will spend more money and more time on his practical joke against you than you could ever spend on his. I've been talking about him for a while now, and I haven't even mentioned this. And the reason why I haven't mentioned this is because I don't think it's the most important thing he did in his life. I'll tell you what I think was the most important thing he did in his life in a moment, but anybody can run for president. That's not a big deal. All you got to be is 35 and a U.S. citizen. I'll never forget, though, the night I was watching Larry King in 1992. And Larry said, are you going to throw your hat in the ring? And Ross said, only if Americans put me on the ballot in 50 states, which is an impossibility. You can't get on the ballot as a third party in 50 states, but something happens. They called it Perot-mania. He took off. Time CNN poll had him at 34%. It had President H.W. Bush at 28. It had Governor Bill Clinton at 24. Man. Dana Carvey, remember how he used to make fun of him? Yeah. But I liked his campaign. I liked it enough to vote for him. I liked the way he talked about ethics. I liked the way he talked about that giant sucking sound of jobs leaving. I liked the way he talked about the national debt, which, back then was $2 trillion, and today it's $22 trillion. And I admired the way he started a third party. And he did pretty well. I mean, for a third party, he got 19% of the vote, which was 1 out of 5 Americans. Think how well he would have done if he hadn't quit halfway through. And I brought some of these magazines because they really kind of tell the story. When he first started out, they didn't know what to make of him, so they put on the cover, waiting for Perot. He's leading in the polls, but can he lead the nation? And then they're peppering him with questions because he had never held public office, so he had no record. So they ask him about GM and EDS and all the business, the Navy, and he doesn't like being asked all these questions. And so what happens next is Time magazine puts this black border on, which I guess is subliminal, meaning a funeral or something, because they say nobody's perfect that doubts about Ross Perot. And I think what happened was he was so burned out from all this campaigning and all this questioning of his record. And then there were some practical jokes that were supposed to be played on a couple of his daughters that really frustrated him. Because like I said, this story is about love and family, and you do not want to mess with his children. And then what happened was he did this. He quit. And this cover of Newsweek magazine probably hurt him more than anything could, because he knew he wasn't a quitter. So he takes the summer off, and it's great, really smart politics, because nobody bothers him. Nobody digs into his life. But then in October, without telling anybody, he just makes this rash decision. He jumps back in again. And this cover of Time says he's back. And it has him, I know you can't see it up in the balcony, but he's in the little head just coming up from the top. So, it's ironic. He gets the 19% of the vote. He's the best third-party showing since Teddy Roosevelt ran in 1912 on the Bull Moose Party. Did I mention, I don't remember, that he named his camel Teddy? Yeah, because he was Teddy Roosevelt the camel. So, he did great, and he ran for president again in 96, and the magic was gone, but he changed politics. He showed how you can talk to people without being focus grouped. When he came back in October, they put him in 3 debates, and he won the first debate. The reason why he won it, because Americans loved his folksy, East Texas, logical, common sense way of speaking. But as I said, that's not the most important thing he did. The most important thing he did in his life was, I believe, to follow his mother's lesson and to be philanthropic. Not only to give money away, but to love people. I don't think there was a philanthropist anywhere with his creative skills. I mean, if you're a police officer and you were shot in the line of work, he'd pay for the funeral and he'd pay for the kid's college education. I mean, if you worked at EDS and a relative of yours was sick, he'd fly your relative to the Mayo Clinic or to the best doctors in the world, and then he'd bring him back here and he'd put him in a suite at UT Southwestern. Not a room, a suite. And he'd show up. How's she doing, doctor? What are the nurses? What can you tell me? I mean, he invested in people. He invested in people. We have the Mort Meyerson Symphony Center. Mort said, don't name that after me. I'm from Fort Worth. We're low-key. Ross, you're the one that likes to be out there. And Ross said, if I give the money, I can name it. And, of course, when they were building the U.S. Interagency for Cooperation between the different branches of the military in Fort Leavenworth, he donated for that. They said, we're going to name it the Ross Perot Agency. He said, no, you're not. And that's why we have the Bull Simons Center for International Cooperation. He named it after Bull. And, of course, we've got the museum, which the kids funded, mostly with a $50 million donation. And that represents his hope for America. Science. Catch up. Let's get our kids interested in science. My favorite story, I think, is UT Southwestern. The first time he gave money to them, it was $200,000. And they came back the next year and said, can you give us more? And he said, no. And they said, why? And he said, because I don't hear your name mentioned. I hear about Harvard Medical School and Stanford Medical School and Johns Hopkins, but I don't hear about UT Southwestern Medical School. And when I do hear about it, I will help you. And the very next year, 2 doctors won the Nobel Prize for Medicine from UT Southwest. And so he threw him a banquet, and he started pouring millions of dollars into that hospital for Gulf War syndrome and PTSD. And I talked to the secretary of the man who ran that philanthropy program with him, and she said, yeah, that's how it went down. Ross said, it all starts with a phone call. I'm sitting here at work doing my business when someone calls with a problem. And I say, hey, I like that. We got to saddle up and we got to do this. Ross Jr. said, every day my father came to work to figure out how he could help somebody. I mean, that's what we have in common. I'm the watchdog. Every day I go to work figuring out how I can help somebody. I just don't have $7.4 billion. I want to mention Margot, his wife. They were married for over 60 years, and just a few months ago, she was given the top philanthropic award that you can get in Dallas, the Linz Award, L-I-N-Z. And the way they met was really kind of charming. She was at college in Baltimore, and he was at the Naval Academy in Maryland. And she didn't want to go out on a blind date, but her dorm mates persuaded her. And she didn't want to meet a Texan. She didn't want to go out with a guy in a cowboy hat and cowboy boots. She had never seen a Texan before except in movies. And they said, well, Margot, if you go and you don't like him, you can leave. She goes, okay, I'll go. So she goes, and she meets him. And she kind of falls for him pretty quick. She tells Ken Follett later in an interview, she says, I loved his sense of humor. And when I left, I could imagine myself living on a ranch in Texas. And she goes back to the dorm, and the girls say, well, what'd you think of him? What'd you think? And she goes, he was clean. And they go, what are you talking about? And she goes, he was clean cut. He was in his Navy uniform and with his short hair and his polished shoes. And, also, I want to mention, quickly his daughters. He had 4 daughters. He has 4 daughters. And, Nancy is the most visible one, I guess, because she's the owner of the best bookstore in Dallas, in Terabang Books. And the others were involved in the foundation, but they lead much quieter lives, I also want to talk a little bit about Junior, because I've got to watch Junior up close for almost 30 years. And calling him a mega developer doesn't do him justice. I mean, he's bigger than that. He's got Alliance, Texas, but he's got Alliance, Florida, and he's got Alliance, California. And I just learned a few weeks ago, he has Alliance in Poland. It's amazing what he's done. He has 27,000 acres there, and he's put up all these communities. And in a Perot community, you live, shop, work, and play. You don't ever have to leave. I loved living in Perotville. I did. He's building his first skyscraper now in downtown Dallas. And, they say that the economic impact, that's how they measure their value. The economic impact of Alliance is $100 billion. There's 556 companies they announced last week there. It's just absolutely amazing. And that's why Fort Worth is the 12th largest city in America now. It's because the seed money from all of his endeavors helped Junior start Alliance and keep it going. So we owe a lot to them for the kind of quality of life that we have over there. And of course, Junior is kind of a showman in a good way, I mean, do you remember a few months ago when he decided to donate a helicopter to the Dallas Police Department? He and his wife, Sarah, they kind of flew in this helicopter, and they landed right in front of the government building, and they gave the keys to the city. That's just kind of cool. It's just kind of cool. So in 2019, he got sick, 89 years old, leukemia. I thought about one of his favorite puns. He used to say, I'm Texas born, I'm Texas bred, and when I die, I'll be Texas dead. In my play, Perot, American Patriot, he has passed away, but he doesn't know it. He comes out on stage and he sees an audience of people and he figures he's running for president again. So he has to justify his existence in this play, and he has to explain what he's accomplished and why and how so that he can go to heaven. And I don't think I'll be giving you away any secrets to say that he did make it into heaven, but that wasn't so tough, because he performed miracles, I mean, he performed a miracle every 2 or 3 hours of his adult life. He was helping somebody all the time. You just don't see that. So, in my book, I'm proud of this book. This is the best book that I've written of my 9. I've been watching that family for 28, 29 years, and there's so much to say. The book is nothing like the play. The play is his story, but the book is my memoir, telling what it was like to cover the family and learning about them and all the different things we went through. It's got a lot of funny moments in there, too. And it's not even like the speech. So It's 192 pages with 60 photos, and I'll be out by the vine, and I'd be happy to sign it for you for, gift for somebody. And I'm really proud of it. I also brought some of my Eamon Carter books, too, because the two of them are really, they represent Mr. Fort Worth and Mr. Dallas. It's the DFW package, And also, I'm taking $10 off the listed bookstore price, which I call the immense Rejebian discount. Okay. How am I doing, Romance? Okay. Good. Okay. One reviewer in the book said, Lieber calls his book Searching for Perot. Our conclusion is he found him. I just wanted people to remember his community involvement, his patriotism, and his innovation, because it's not of this world. He was a superhuman in all the different things that he could accomplish in the way he did. Now, I'm going to end this with explaining to you why I took this on, why I decided to spend a couple of years researching, reading, studying, talking to people. It's because of something that happened in this church. You all know that the funeral in July of 2019 was over in the sanctuary, right? Because his church was under renovation and they couldn't handle a big crowd. But I'm watching this funeral on rossperot.com, and I see the finest, most elegant eulogy that I have ever heard from Ross Perot Jr. to his dad. I mean, what a better way to pay tribute to your late father than to give a really great eulogy. I love his eulogy so much that I think it should be taught in schools. And then when I'm done with, I'm going to read you the final paragraphs of it, and then when I'm done, if there's time for questions or comments, we can do that. But remember I said this is a story about love of people, love of family. This is what love looks like. This is what love looks like. Ross Jr. stood in this church and he said, Dad never wanted to slow down. But in February of this year, our father knew we only had months to go. The Lord gave us another 5 months with Dad. And during that time, he was still going to the office on weekdays and to the lake each weekend. He was surrounded by his family, friends, and wonderful caregivers. Mom and Dad would spend their nights holding hands and watching classic movies, and Dad still wanted to dance with Mom. Our last trip to the lake was 3 Saturdays ago. I arrived 5 minutes late, and Dad still gave me the look. On the way out, Dad insisted that he stop and give Mom a kiss. And at the lake, we sat together holding hands, looking at the water. We did not say much. We did not need to. We had said all we could to each other. He sat in his father's rocking chair, and he looked at photos of his mother and his father. And eventually, my dad passed away in peace, surrounded by his family, holding my mother's hand. Condolences have come in from around the world, and my father touched the lives of millions. My father had courage, character, integrity, legendary qualities, a true patriot. My father will be missed, but never forgotten. Ross Perot did his duty to God, his country, his family, his friends. He helped other people at all times. His legacy will live through all he touched. Thank you, God, for this wonderful man. Buddies, to the end. Thank you. Thank you.
All right. We're past 8, and we want to make sure everybody gets up there and buys a book. I want 4 of them, please. This has been so fabulous, but David will end us.
Yeah, the only thing I'll say is, because we did start a little late, my grandmother would have been pretty happy because she was pretty much of a stickler about the review should last 1 hour. So I think you kind of fit in that time parameter. And we want to give everybody time to go get the Airmines Rejebian discount on the books upstairs. So Dave, thanks. We're not going to wait 10 more years to have you back.
Thank you.
So write something else.
Well,
And we'll see everybody next week for Nancy Ashley.
I'd like to come back next year and do Eamon Carter for you. That's it.
You're on.